Well, it's a delight to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity to present on our work. We are funded by the Minnesota Institute for Terrestrial, the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Pests and Pathogen Center, and we've been doing this work for the last 4 or 5 years, funded from a variety of sources. I myself have been working on oaks from physiological, ecological, and evolutionary perspective for the last couple of decades, and Jenny Jeswick, who's in the audience, is a plant pathologist with the U.S. Forest Service, and we teamed up also together with Rebecca Montgomery and in the forestry department and a host of other folks, including an Airborne team, and really talented postdocs to get to where we are now in terms of understanding how we can use remote sensing, proximal remote sensing, to understand and detect oak wilt. What I want to get to today is why we should invest in oak wilt management, what is the problem, and why is it worth really aggressively going after. And then prospects for oak wilt detection using UAVs. And I'll highlight along the way some of the challenges and limits to using UAVs in oak wilt detection and management. So why focus on oaks? Well, they are the most diverse woody genus in North America. They have over 260 species in the Americas, over 400 species worldwide. They are the most diverse woody genus in the United States. They also are the genus with the most woody biomass. And in deciduous forests, they make up about 30% in both the US and Mexico of total basal area. And as a consequence of that abundance and their other properties, you can't hear me? Oh, this is the missing piece.
That was knocking around, so that's why it was.
All right, how's that? Better. So you can hear the critical part. In the United States alone, oaks, if you just calculate the carbon storage value, the annual carbon storage value, they're responsible for about $10.7 billion based on the social cost of carbon, about $11 billion in annual air pollution removal value, and about $577 million in wood product annual net revenues. So just thinking about it from an ecosystem service benefit, they are really an important group. They also have a whole host of ecological benefits. They support wildlife and biodiversity. They're important for erosion control. Property values are raised by having oaks in their yard because of their aesthetic value. They're important for soil microbial health. And before I get into talking about drones per se, I want to give you a little bit of background on oaks. And from an evolutionary perspective, where did they come from? How did we get so many species? There was a common ancestor that came to the Americas some 40 million years ago. There's a common ancestor that was at high latitude that came over from Asia and diversified, moving southward, leading to this 260 species of oaks that we now have in the Americas. And they spread throughout the continent. Importantly, there are two major lineages. Do I have a pointer? There are two major lineages, oaks in the red oak group and the white oak group. And that's important for oak wilt because these two lineages that occur throughout the continent have different susceptibilities to the oak wilt disease. The red oaks are highly vulnerable. They die within a year or two, and the white oaks have much higher, their defenses work better, and so they're less susceptible to disease. It might take them up to 15, 20 years to die from the disease. So let me introduce the disease itself, and Jenny Jeswick has been working on this most of her career, is really an expert on it. So it's a fungal pathogen, Bretziella phagoserum. It was formerly Ceratocystis phagoserum. It's lethal, and it's considered one of the most destructive threat to oaks in the United States. This is a Forest Service map showing the counties that it has been detected in 2016. And on the left is a photo just showing the fungal mats that form in the vascular cambium. So it's a wilt disease. It's a fungal pathogen that goes through the vascular system, and it can be spread through spores over land and then move down through the vascular system into the roots. Once it gets into the roots, then it actually spreads quite rapidly to its neighbors through root grafting as the fungus moves between adjacent root systems. So this understanding the way the disease spreads is critical for managing it and also for understanding how we want to detect it, the different methods we want to use for detection. Overland spread is slower, but if you can catch when it first appears, then you can stop it spreading below ground to its neighbors. And so UAVs may be most essential for rapid detection to prevent below ground spread. This is what it looks like in one of the red oak species, Quercus ellipsoidalis, northern pin oak, and it kills, you can see the leaf wilt in the canopy that's just happening within a single season, characteristic symptoms of the leaves. Here you can see in an oak wilt pocket that's forming. And then bur oak, this is a white oak. This is the species in the white oak lineage. You don't get full canopy wilt all in a single season. You'll get a branch at a time. And so the symptoms look different in species in the white oak group. This is an oak wilt pocket, and it's often treated by severing the roots between adjacent trees to prevent the spread of the disease. So this is primary way that the disease is contained, is digging trenches, plowing with a deep blade into the soil around the diseased trees, and then in a layer beyond the visibly diseased trees to make sure the ones that are starting to get sick are not spreading it from truly healthy ones. And this is Paul Kajawa, who's been doing this for many years with a very deep blade, putting in those plow lines to sever adjacent trees, the root connections between adjacent trees. And typically it's done with a single plow line. Jenny Jeswick has thought that a double plow line would be more effective because after 6 or 7 years, the roots start to regraft. But if you have 2 plow lines, you can prevent that. So we're experimenting with the double plow line to see if that's more effective. And in general, these methods are very effective in containing the disease once you know where it is. And so knowing where the disease has hit is really critical, and that's why the interest in possibly using UAVs. UAVs are already used by the Menominee Nation to manage their vast forest system. And they fly drones annually. They detect where new oak wilt has hit, and then they immediately go in and manage. So here you can see they can pick out an individual tree with these drone surveys. They're just using RGB cameras, and they can see a wilting tree, and then they go out there and they girdle the tree, and that cuts off the supply of sugars moving from the leaves down to the roots, and it also can help prevent fungal spread when they add the herbicide treatment to kill the tree. So what they're trying to do is prevent the fungus from moving down into the roots so that it doesn't spread to neighbors. And if they can detect the sick tree quickly enough, they can contain it without needing to plow, to put in the plow lines. So that's the idea of this rapid response. Of course, it requires vigilance, and I'll get to some other issues that give them a bit of an advantage. So on Rob's encouragement, we went out and tried to see just what this might look like with a relatively inexpensive drone. This is the DJI Inspire 2, and we flew it over the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve that is just riddled with oak wilt. And Centera has developed this very user-friendly software where you can set the flight path and have the drone just fly autonomously where you tell it to go. And I'll just give you a little visual of what that imagery looks like.
flying the drone over Cedar Creek. And so this was October last year. You can see a bit of the fall coloration. And you can pick out dead trees really nicely. This is just an RGB camera. Here you see another oak wilt pocket. And here again, you could see dead trees really, really well with the drone. So the question is whether detecting dead trees is sufficient or whether we can do better than just using a drone to detect dead trees. I mean, is this really more cost effective than walking around on the ground and looking for dead trees? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges with using UAVs. One of them is the line of sight issue because you're required to keep the drone in the line of sight. You also want to keep your drone in the line of sight because it's fairly expensive and you don't want it flying off into never be seen again. And so one possibility is to have a platform or an aerial lift that you can use for line of sight, or actually it may be possible to have a second very inexpensive drone, if this is permitted, that is what's actually keeping an eye on your actual drone with the sensor in it. There are also exemptions. The Menominee Nation is able to get around the line of sight issue because they're a sovereign nation. But this will present a real challenge for the use of UAVs, and we have to think about ways to get around that. At Cedar Creek, it's actually fairly open, and so we were able to keep the drone in line of sight easily, but in a lot of forests, that's not the case. The other issue is that UAVs are useful at the local scale, but over vast areas, it's not going, there you really want to use something like satellite detection. So UAVs will be important as part of an integrated detection approach from the leaf level to the local scale, and then moving into aircraft and satellites. It's not going to be the only solution, but it'll be part of an important detection program. And they'll provide the most utility for rapid detection, like I showed you with the Menominee Nation, assuming that it gives us more information than just walking around on the ground and is more cost effective. So we want a cost-effective solution that gives us more information than we would get by just moving around on the ground. So over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been using hyperspectral reflectance information, which provides quite a bit of information about how about surfaces, their chemical and structural attributes. And for plants, they're incredibly informative. So from a single leaf, we learn a lot about the anatomy and the chemistry from reflectance within the range of about 400 to 2,500 nanometers. We get so much information about the variation among plants with this kind of, with hyperspectral data, that we can actually link plants based on their spectral fingerprint to the tree of life and identify species. This is a false color image based on hyperspectral data. We've done this with 2 airborne sensors. One is from the Nebraska Calumet Observatory between 400 and 1,100 nanometers. And then we've also used NASA's Avarice Next Generation sensor between 400 and 2,500 nanometers. They both have a spatial resolution of about 1 meter. The points, the colored points, are known, are trees with known species and health status. Another important criteria to think about is not just being able to identify a dead tree, but being able to identify sick trees and knowing why they're sick. Because if you know that it's a red oak and it's sick, then you know it's going to die and it needs to be managed immediately. But if it is a bur oak and it is sick, it could be bur oak blight, and then you don't want to kill that tree. So more information than just it's sick or it's dead is critical to good management. And so some of the stress factors that have similar visible symptoms are bur oak blight and drought. And there are a host of other stress factors too. So we've been thinking about these, and also the fact that the different lineages express different systems because of their different susceptibility. We've been taking a multiscale approach, and so we've been thinking about how to differentiate oak wilt in reds and white oaks, and in the white oaks, in the bur oaks, between oak wilt and bur oak blight, and then how to differentiate those symptoms from drought at the leaf level, at the canopy level, and at the landscape level. So we've been using a multiscale approach using different kinds of platforms and sensors. And I'll start first by talking about the airborne data at the landscape level, and this is postdoc Anna Schweiger and Kathleen Nguyen, who've been working on this project. And first thing is with hyperspectral data, and this is using up to 1,100 nanometers, so 400 to 1,100 nanometers. The models we use partial least squares discriminant analysis as a statistical approach for pulling out the components of the data that are most informative for the thing we're trying to predict, in this case, species identities. The matrix shows different species, and the diagonal gives the probability that we can accurately detect that species. The off diagonals are the probability that we incorrectly assign the species, assign a pixel to the wrong species. And so what you see, the green indicates high accuracy, and what you see is very high accuracy in identifying species from airborne data at 1 meter spatial resolution, Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, and there are about 12 species in this system. If we just want to know oaks and differentiate them from other oaks, we do that with really high accuracies. So the very large green circles, we have an accuracy of about 84%. And if we want to differentiate, once we know it's an oak, a healthy from a diseased oak, we do that with extremely high accuracy, so 96%. And this pink line here indicates which wavelengths are most important, which then becomes really useful in trying to pick out bands that we could put on a more inexpensive sensor on a UAV. So let me get more to that. So I'll just summarize what I just told you. So distinguishing oaks from non-oaks, we have about 84% accuracy. Distinguishing a red and a white oak, those two lineages, is about 91% accuracy. And then when we've gotten that far, differentiating a healthy from an unhealthy or an oak wilt infected oak specifically, we have about 96% accuracy. So this works really well when we have a full range, actually 400 to 1,100 nanometer data. We've then, in greenhouse experiments, infected with different pathogens, so oak wilt, bur oak blight, and then also imposed drought. I'm not going to go into the details, but I'll tell you with canopy level measurements, but in an experimental system, we are able to accurately differentiate different stress factors. So we can differentiate drought from bur oak blight and from oak wilt. And then Gerard Sapes, a postdoc, spent the summer using spectral information, canopy level, to see what happens, how well could he detect oak wilt in the field under more natural conditions. Jenny Jeswick inoculated half the trees, and then the others were left as controls. And so we're just comparing oak wilt and control. And from that, we're really thinking about the physiology of the disease development. What is happening with the plant before your eyes can actually see what's going on? Can you detect if the plant is getting sick? And so we use the quantum yield of photosynthesis measured with chlorophyll fluorescence. This is commonly done by plant physiologists. It's a handheld instrument. And you can see that the photosynthetic function of the oak wilt infected plants is really declining throughout the course of the season as the disease progresses, whereas the control maintains its function. If we then use spectral data, but we just pick out two bands that are very closely related to what the quantum yield direct sensing information gives us. This is at the leaf level, but it's scaled up to the canopy. We see very nice detection of oak wilt. And then when we actually take measurements over the top of the canopy, like you get with a UAV, again, you see very nice detection of oak wilt relative to the control, and the colors indicate when you start to see visual symptoms. So you can detect that it's sick before you can actually see it, and that is important. And this is with 2 bands, 2 wavelengths. So then if we compare wavelengths that give us diagnostic signals of oak wilt at the leaf level, the canopy level, and the landscape level with airborne data, we actually can find consistent bands at all 3 of these scales using hyperspectral data that are very informative. Just using 2-band indices, these all, the photochemical reflectance index, the renormalized difference vegetation index, which is getting at photosynthetic function, and this is getting at stress response, and then the water band index gets at the wilting process. All of these are indicative of oak wilt at all 3 scales. And so this is where we would go to actually build a cost-effective sensor on an inexpensive drone. And then Gerard has further looked at when through the season in the progression of the disease we can really start to differentiate oak wilt from controls. You can see it even after 2 weeks, but it really becomes detectable after 25 days. And these graphs show which wavelengths are most important in detecting the disease, and you can see that it's very consistent throughout the progression of the disease which wavelengths are important. So this then gives us the information we need to then go to Centera and say, hey, can you build an 8-band sensor for us that's relatively inexpensive so that we can try rapid detection that gives us more information than simply detecting dead trees. We can actually see the disease development before our eyes can. And this gives us a sense that we really do have strong prospects for UAVs for rapid oak wilt detection at local scales. We still have this problem of maintaining a line of sight that we have to figure out. And there are trade-offs between accuracy and cost. So hyperspectral data works really well, but it's very expensive, and most people don't want to put their hyperspectral sensors on a drone. At least it's not going to be a widespread use of the technology because it's so expensive to do that. But an inexpensive drone with the inexpensive sensors is likely to be much more widely used. And so we're proposing an 8-band vis-near, so visible near-infrared sensor set, so 2 quant sensors that would be cost effective and provide us physiological information in advance of visible symptoms. So I will stop there.
We do have time for a few questions.
Yeah. So she had a question.
Right here.
So were there specific seasons that were best for doing this survey work? And were there times of day or other conditions that led to better outcomes?
Well, okay, so survey work. So I don't have a good answer for you right now. So I think the Menominee folks would be really good at giving you that information. It's got to be at a time when you can fly the drone, and you really do have to decide when through the progression of the disease you're trying to detect it. And it can appear in different times we've realized, and Jenny can talk a lot more about this, but it's not just that it always appears at the beginning of the season and there's a perfect time to detect it. It actually, depending on the way the infection occurred, it can appear at different times through the season. And so I don't know if there is an optimal, that's a good question actually, and I don't know the answer, but it's a little bit complicated. So I wouldn't say, July 21st is the best time to do the detection. It's got to be a time when you can fly, and it would be nice if you could catch the pre-visual symptoms, so the symptoms that your eye can't see that the detector can. And so mid-season seems like a good time for that, enough time for the leaves to be fully developed and the disease to have made some progress, but not already so advanced that the tree is dead and the fungus has been spreading below ground.
So I know that, some of the most popular systems from headwall photonics and high specs are right around that $50,000 mark. So
Yeah.
do you find inexpensive in kind of your vision for this sensor development?
Yeah, so we love using all that stuff. It's fun for scientists to have access to that kind of equipment, and it works really well. We get really good detection accuracies with headwall data, and we've tried high specs too. We're still analyzing it. But I think for UAVs, it's just impractical to expect forest managers to want to spend that kind of money and then risk losing their drone, especially with this line of sight issue. It's just too costly. So the one that, so we've been talking with Centera, and these folks are here. That one should be about $17,000 to have an 8-band sensor. And it's a relatively easy to use drone. The software is really easy to use. And we have to test that, but I think we can get really good information from that that's better than just an RGB camera or just NDVI. It gives us more physiological information and more information directly linked to oak wilt and the water status and so forth, but is not fully hyperspectral. We don't have to, yeah.
Yeah, and kind of almost to follow up on that, you'd mentioned in the presentation about getting some useful results with just looking at 2 bands. And so can you comment more on the why you might be looking at 8 bands as sort of a next step versus jumping straight to the 2 bands?
Yeah, it's because of the problem I mentioned before of differentiating between oak wilt and bur oak blight, and also being able to differentiate the 2 lineages of oaks. If you could know that you had a white oak rather than a red oak, it would be more informative for management. And if you knew that you actually had wilting, what we actually see with the physiological work is that drought response has a very different signature, spectral signature, than oak wilt response. And if you can look at bands that give you information about wilting and bands that give you information about photosynthetic function, you can start to separate a drought effect from an oak wilt effect. And so, I would actually like to have 300 bands to do this. It would be really nice, but it's a trade-off. So I think if we have 8 bands, which is what Centera tells us we can get with 2 quant sensors, we're just picking the best 8 bands we can get for the least cost, and so it's an efficiency, cost efficiency proposal.